Hey, my name is Caleb. I'm 30 years old, and I run a cattle ranch about 4 miles south of Livingston, Montana, on a piece of land my grandfather bought in 1971 with money he'd saved from 20 years of working the rail yard in Billings. It's 410 acres of grass and sage and creek bottom, bordered on the north side by the Yellowstone River and on the south by a county road that doesn't get plowed until the second day after a snowstorm, which tells you everything you need to know about where this stretch of the valley falls on the county's list of priorities. I run about 80 head of Black Angus on the property. I do it mostly by myself. I've got a part-time hand named Miguel who comes in 3 days a week during calving season. And I've got Gene Pickett, who ranches the property north of mine and is 67 years old and comes over whenever he pleases, which is usually whenever his wife Ruth tells him he's underfoot and needs to go make himself useful somewhere else. Other than that, it's me, the cattle, a border collie named Hutch, who is 12 and has earned the right to spend most of his afternoons asleep in a patch of sun on the porch, and 400 acres of Montana that don't care what kind of day I'm having. My days go like this. I'm up before 5, which isn't discipline. It's the cattle. They don't know what a weekend is, and they don't know what sleeping in means, so neither do I. I make coffee on the stove in a steel percolator that was my grandfather's. Check the herd from the porch with binoculars if the light is good enough. Pull on my boots and go. I feed in the winter. I move fence in the spring. I check water tanks, mend wire, haul hay, dig post holes, pull calves when they come wrong, and fix every piece of equipment on the property myself, because the nearest mechanic who'll work on ranch trucks is 40 minutes away and charges city rates. By late afternoon, I'm usually back at the house, boots on the porch, something cooking on the stove that involves whatever I have and not much of a recipe. I eat at the kitchen table. I sit on the porch until the light goes, and sometimes after. I go to bed early because 4:30 comes whether I'm ready or not. It's a good life. I know that. The land is paid off. The cattle are healthy. The fences hold. I have work I understand in a place I belong, and I don't have to answer to anyone about any of it. But there's a kind of quiet that settles into a ranch house when one person has been eating at a 4-person table for long enough. It's not loneliness the way people in cities mean it. I can go weeks without seeing anyone besides Gene and the checkout clerk at the farm supply in town and feel perfectly normal. It's more like the house itself has gone quiet, like it's waiting for a sound it used to hear and can't remember what it was. I talk to the cattle sometimes. Not in any meaningful way. Just habit. Move up and come on now, and the low whistle my grandfather used to get their attention. Hutch looks at me when I do it, the way dogs look at a person who is doing something they understand, but find vaguely unnecessary. He's not wrong. 3 years ago, a woman named Jess sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me she loved me and she was leaving. She said it in that order, which I think was deliberate, because the first part was supposed to make the second part hurt less. It didn't. She said, "Caleb, I love you, but I cannot spend the rest of my life on 400 acres with a man whose whole world stops at the fence line. I need roads. I need somewhere to go. You need this ranch and this valley and this exact view of the mountains every morning, and I understand that, but I need more. And I'm going to feel guilty about that for a long time, but I'm still going." I didn't argue. I didn't ask her to stay. I held the gate open, literally and otherwise, because I'd spent my whole life around animals and I knew one thing for certain. You cannot fence in something that needs to run. It will hurt itself trying to get out, and it will hurt you for building the fence. So I let her go. She drove her car down the gravel road and turned left onto the county highway, and I watched until the dust settled, and then I went and fed the cattle because they still needed feeding, and at least that was something I knew how to do. I don't blame her. I never did. She was right about every word. My world does end at the fence line. I've just never figured out whether that's a flaw or a fact, and after 3 years of not being able to tell the difference, I've stopped trying. That Tuesday, in late September, the aspens were going gold in the river bottom, and the sky was the kind of blue that only happens in Montana in autumn, so clear and deep it almost looks fake, like someone adjusted the color too high. I was driving back from the farm supply in Livingston, with a truck bed full of fencing staples and mineral blocks, when I saw a person walking on the county road about a half-mile from my gate. Walking on the county road, 4 miles from town. No sidewalk, no shoulder, nothing but gravel and sage, and the mountains standing around like they'd been there before any of this, and planned to be there after. She was carrying 2 grocery bags, the paper kind, not plastic, and wearing a jacket that was fine for Portland, but not for a Montana evening when the temperature drops 15 degrees in the time it takes the sun to touch the Absarokas. Her hair was dark and pulled back in a braid that had mostly come undone, and she was walking with the specific determination of someone who knows they made a mistake but has decided they're going to finish it anyway. I almost drove past. I had fencing to unload and mineral to distribute and about 2 hours of daylight left, and none of my schedule included stopping for a stranger carrying groceries down a county road like it was a sidewalk. But she shifted one of the bags to her hip and a carton of eggs slid sideways, and she caught it with her free hand. Fast. Precise. Without breaking stride, and something about that small act of competence in the middle of an obviously bad situation made me hit the brakes. I rolled down the window. "You need a ride?" She looked at me the way I've seen cattle look at an unfamiliar truck, alert, deciding, measuring the risk against the discomfort of the current situation. "I live about a half-mile down the road," she said. "The old Dawson place." "I know the Dawson place. That's my neighbor." "Then I guess we're neighbors. You walk to town. From the Dawson place. 4 miles. "I don't drive," she said. And she said it the way you say something you're tired of explaining, flat, factual, just getting it out before anyone can react to it. I leaned over and opened the passenger door. "Get in. I'll take you home." She hesitated for exactly 2 seconds. Then she put the grocery bags on the floor of the cab and climbed in and closed the door and sat there with her hands in her lap and her undone braid over one shoulder, smelling like cold air and the brown paper of grocery bags. And she looked straight ahead through the windshield at the mountains going pink in the last light and said, "Thank you. I'm June." I drove her to the Dawson place. It took about 90 seconds. The house was small, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that still had Helen Dawson's yellow curtains, a porch that faced the mountains. June's things were sparse inside, visible through the windows I'd driven past 100 times when the Dawsons lived there. A few boxes. A lamp, a suitcase still standing upright by the door like it hadn't decided whether it was staying. She took the groceries inside. I waited in the truck because I wasn't sure what the protocol was for a conversation between new neighbors that had started on the side of a road. She came back out onto the porch and crossed her arms against the cold and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. Would you teach me to drive?" I looked at her. She looked back without flinching, but there was something underneath the directness. A thinness in her voice, like a wire stretched too tight, like asking had cost her something she wasn't going to show me. "You've never driven?" "I grew up in Chicago. I took the L. I walked. I didn't need a car and I never learned. But I live here now, and the nearest grocery store is 4 miles away, and I just carried eggs for 40 minutes on a gravel road. I need to learn. And you're the closest person with a truck. I should have said no. I had a ranch to run. Calving wasn't far off. The south fence needed mending before the first snow, and the first snow in the Paradise Valley doesn't wait for anyone's schedule. I didn't have time to sit in a truck with a stranger and teach her the difference between the brake and the gas. But she was standing on Helen Dawson's porch in a jacket that wasn't warm enough, holding her own arms like she was keeping herself from coming apart. And she had asked me for something she clearly did not enjoy asking for. And there's a thing my grandfather used to say about neighbors. A fence between properties is just a line on a map. You live next to someone. You help them. That's the whole arrangement. Saturday morning, I said. 9 o'clock. I'll bring the truck. Thank you, Caleb. I didn't remember telling her my name, but in Livingston, everybody knows who runs the old Watts Ranch. I drove home and unloaded the fencing staples and fed the cattle and sat on the porch with Hutch and watched the last light drain off the mountains and thought about a woman who had carried grocery bags 4 miles on a gravel road rather than ask for help, and who had finally asked, and what that must have taken. The first lesson was a disaster. I say that with no exaggeration and some admiration. June sat in the driver's seat of my truck, a '98 Ford F-250 that weighs about 3 tons and has all the responsive handling of a locomotive, and she gripped the steering wheel like it owed her money. I showed her the mirrors, the pedals, the gear shift. I explained the basics. She nodded at each one like she was memorizing a code. She put the truck in drive. She touched the gas. The truck lurched forward like a horse that's been stung, and she overcorrected the wheel, and we went sideways across the gravel. And she hit the brakes so hard that everything in the truck bed, including a bag of mineral salt and a coil of baling wire, slid forward and hit the cab with a sound like a small explosion. "Sorry," she said, white-knuckled. "You're fine. Try again. Lighter on the gas this time." She tried again. We made it about 200 yards down the county road before she drifted left, panicked, overcorrected right, and put us in the ditch. Not aggressively. The truck just kind of settled into it, like a large animal lying down in a spot it found comfortable. We sat there for a moment, tilted slightly, the engine idling. "This is going well," she said. I looked at her. She looked at me. And then she laughed. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded. The kind that comes up from somewhere you don't control. And I laughed too. Which surprised me because I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed at anything louder than something Hutch did in his sleep. We got the truck out of the ditch. We kept going. The lessons became a routine. Every Saturday and Wednesday morning, 9 o'clock, I'd drive the truck to her place, and we'd switch seats, and she'd drive. The first 2 weeks were genuinely terrible. She stalled at the intersection in town. She clipped my mailbox backing out of the driveway. My mailbox, which had survived 30 Montana winters and was now tilting at a 15-degree angle. She nearly hit a mule deer on the river road and swerved so hard we ended up in a turnout facing the wrong direction. But she was trying. That was the thing. She showed up every session. She didn't make excuses. She gripped the wheel and she swore under her breath. She had a vocabulary for frustration that was creative and specific, and occasionally made me look out the window so she wouldn't see my face. And she got a little better each time. And between the disasters, we talked. That's the thing about a truck cab. It's a small space with a big windshield. And when someone's driving and someone's sitting shotgun, you're both facing the same direction, which makes it easier to say things you might not say face to face. She told me about Chicago. She told me about her job there. She'd been an occupational therapist at a rehab center, helping people learn to use their bodies again after strokes and injuries. She described it with a precision that made me understand she'd been good at it. Really good, and that leaving had been harder than she let on. Why Montana? I asked. On a Wednesday, while she carefully navigated the 2-lane toward Livingston at a speed that made the rancher behind us visibly impatient. Because it's the opposite of everything I knew. Chicago is loud and flat, and you're never alone. Montana is quiet and vertical, and I haven't seen my neighbor in 4 days. I'm your neighbor. You see me twice a week. You're my driving instructor. That's different. Is it? She didn't answer. She signaled a turn, correctly, for the first time in 4 lessons, and I let the question sit where it was. By the 3rd week, something had shifted, not in her driving, which was still erratic in ways I couldn't entirely predict, but in the rest of it. She started coming over to the ranch between lessons. The first time, she brought coffee from the gas station in town, which meant she had walked 8 miles round trip to bring me coffee, which I pointed out, and she said I needed the exercise in a tone that meant she was not interested in discussing her motivations. She met Hutch, who loved her immediately and with the absolute commitment that only old dogs are capable of. She met the cattle, about whom she had opinions. She said the heifer with the crooked blaze looked like a philosopher. She said the bull looked like a man she used to work with. She did not elaborate. She started helping with chores. Not because I asked, I didn't, but because she'd show up, and there'd be work to do, and she'd do it. She hauled water buckets without being shown how. She held fence wire while I stapled. She learned to drive the ATV within 15 minutes, which I found interesting, because the AT requires the same basic skills as a truck, and she drove it with a confidence and steadiness that didn't quite match the woman who had put my F-250 in a ditch 3 days earlier. I filed that observation away and didn't say anything about it. One afternoon, she was helping me move a group of yearlings from the south pasture to the creek bottom, and one of them broke away and headed for the open gate at a run. Before I could react, June was moving, not running after it, but angling across the pasture at a diagonal, cutting off its escape route with a kind of spatial intelligence that doesn't come from nowhere. The yearling stopped, turned, and walked back to the group. June stood there in the middle of the pasture with her braid coming undone and her boots covered in mud and looked at me like she wasn't sure whether to be proud or embarrassed. "You've worked with animals before," I said. "My uncle had a dairy farm outside of Rockford. I spent summers there until I was 16. You could have mentioned that. You could have asked." She had me there. Gene Pickett showed up one Saturday after a lesson, driving his old Dodge across my property line the way he always did, slowly, window down, hat on, like a man who has decided that fences are suggestions and property lines are just something the government made up to feel useful. He parked next to my truck and watched June drive away down the county road toward her place, weaving slightly. "That the new neighbor?" he said. "That's her." "She learning to drive?" "Trying." Gene watched the truck's dust settle. "Your grandmother didn't know how to drive when she married your grandfather. Did you know that? He taught her in this same field. She put his truck through the fence twice. Second time, she took out the post and 30 feet of wire and your grandfather's best hat, which was hanging on the post, because he'd set it there like an idiot." He paused. "They were married 43 years. "Gene, I'm not saying anything. I'm telling you a story about your grandmother." He looked at me. "But I'll say this. That house of yours has been too quiet for too long. I can hear the quiet from my kitchen, and Ruth can hear it from hers, and we're both tired of it. Whatever you're doing with the driving lessons, do more of it." In the 4th week, on a Wednesday evening after a lesson that had included 2 stalls, a near miss with a mailbox that was not mine, and a 3-point turn that took 11 points, June and I were sitting on my porch. The sun was behind the Absarokas, and the valley was filling up with that particular blue-gold light that happens in Montana in October, when the air is cold and clean, and the sky doesn't know whether it wants to be day or night. Hutch was asleep between our chairs. The cattle were dark shapes against the far fence, settling in. "I was with someone in Chicago," she said. "For 5 years. I waited." The evening was quiet enough to hold whatever came next. His name was Derek. He was an architect. Successful, organized, very good at managing things. Including me. She pulled her jacket tighter. He drove. Everywhere. He drove to work, he drove to dinner, he drove to the grocery store. He chose the route, and he chose the speed, and if I suggested an alternate, he'd explain very patiently why his way was better. He cooked. He chose the meals, and he chose the portions, and if I wanted something different, he'd explain why what he'd made was the healthier option. He paid the bills because I was bad with money, his words. He picked the apartment because I didn't understand real estate. He decided when we went out, and where, and with whom. She was quiet for a moment. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the sage. He never raised his voice. He never hit me. He never did a single thing that I could point at and say that's why I left. He just drove, in every sense of the word. He drove my life. And I sat in the passenger seat for 5 years, because it was comfortable, and because fighting for the wheel felt ungrateful when someone was doing all the work. And then one morning I woke up, and I realized I was 30 years old, and I had never driven a car, never cooked my own dinner, never chosen my own route to anywhere. I was a passenger in every part of my life. And I got out of bed, and I packed a bag, and I left. Did you tell him why? I left a note. It said, "I need to learn to drive." He probably thought I meant it literally. I did mean it literally. But I also meant everything else. She looked at me. The light was almost gone, and her face was half in shadow, and the meadowlark had gone quiet, and the only sound was Hutch breathing in his sleep. "Caleb, I need to tell you something, and I'm going to feel stupid about it, but I'd rather feel stupid than dishonest." "Okay, I learned to drive about 3 weeks ago." I looked at her. "I mean, really learned. I can parallel park. I can merge. I can back your truck up in a straight line, and I have been able to for almost a month. I've been crashing on purpose." The words sat in the air between us. I didn't say anything. She kept going. "The lessons were the only time you'd sit next to me. You're so closed off, Caleb. You're kind, and you're patient, and you show up every single time. But outside the truck you keep this distance like there's a fence around you that I can see, but can't find the gate in. And I didn't know how to ask you to let me closer. I didn't know how to say I like being in the truck with you. I like the way you talk when you're not thinking about it. I like that you don't try to drive my life for me." So I hit the mailbox. I stalled at the intersection. I drove into the ditch. Because every time I messed up, you'd say try again, and that meant I got another hour with you. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, fast, impatient, annoyed at herself for it. I know that's ridiculous. I know a grown woman manufacturing car accidents to spend time with a man is not a normal thing to do. But Derek decided everything for me for 5 years, and when I got here, the one thing I promised myself was that I wouldn't let anyone drive for me again. And then I met you, and I wanted so badly to just be in the truck with you that I pretended I couldn't drive it. And I'm sorry, that's not fair to you. I sat with it. The valley was dark now. The first stars were coming through over the crazies to the east. "You hit my mailbox," I said. "I hit your mailbox. Twice. The second time was genuinely an accident." I looked at her. This woman who had walked 4 miles for groceries and carried eggs on a gravel road and moved a yearling with the instinct of someone who understood animals and driven my ATV like she'd been doing it for years, and sat next to me on this porch and told me the truth about everything, including the parts that made her look foolish, because being foolish was better than being dishonest. "The ATV," I said. "What about it? You drove the ATV perfectly. First try." "I noticed." "I was hoping you wouldn't. I notice everything on this ranch, June. It's how I keep 80 head of cattle alive. I knew something was off. I just didn't know what it was. I thought maybe you were nervous on the roads. I thought maybe the truck was too big. The truck is too big. That part is real. Your truck is an aircraft carrier." I almost smiled. I felt it in my face. Something unfamiliar, like a muscle that hadn't been used in a long time being asked to work. "Jess left because I wouldn't go past the fence line," I said. I didn't plan to say it, but June had just told me the truth about every manufactured crash, and the least I could do was give her something real in return. 3 years ago. She said my whole world stopped at the property boundary and she needed roads. She was right. I built my entire life inside this fence, because inside the fence I understand everything. The cattle, the land, the seasons, the work. Nothing inside the fence surprises me. Nothing asks me to be something I don't already know how to be. And when she left, I pulled the gate tighter. I stopped going into town more than I had to. I stopped talking to people more than I had to. I let the quiet fill in around me like it was insulation, and I told myself it was peace. And it wasn't peace. It was just the sound of a man who stopped trying. I looked at the dark line of the mountains against the stars. When you asked me to teach you to drive, I almost said no. I almost said I didn't have time. And the truth is, I did have time. I had nothing but time. That's the whole problem. What I didn't have was the courage to sit next to someone who might eventually ask me to drive past the fence. And you did. You sat in my truck and you asked me questions. And you made me talk more in 4 weeks than I've talked in 3 years. And I kept coming back every Saturday and every Wednesday, not because I'm patient. June, I'm a rancher. Patience is just the job. But because the truck cab felt different with you in it. Everything felt different. And I wasn't ready to look at that, so I just kept teaching you 3-point turns and pretending I didn't notice that you drove the ATV like a professional. June made a sound that was half laugh and half something else, something broken open and relieved and shaky at the edges. "We're both idiots," she said. "We're both idiots. I've been crashing on purpose for a month. I've been staying inside a fence for 3 years. She reached across the space between our chairs and took my hand. Not gently, firmly, with purpose. The way you take something you've decided you're not going to let go of. Her hand was cold from the evening air and strong from 4 weeks of gripping a steering wheel she didn't need to grip. And I held it back. And Hutch opened one eye and looked at us, and closed it again, satisfied that the situation had been handled and his involvement was not required. The next morning, Gene came over. He didn't say anything for the first 20 minutes. He helped me move hay bales from the barn to the south feeder, working in the easy silence of 2 people who have done the same task side by side enough times that talking is optional. Then, loading the last bale, he said, "Saw a light on in your kitchen last night. Both sides of the table. June came for dinner. She cook? We cooked together." Gene set the bale down and brushed hay off his gloves and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Not his usual dry amusement. Not the veiled concern he'd worn since Jess left. Something simpler. Something that looked like relief. "Your grandfather used to say that a ranch is just a piece of land until someone sits down at the table with you. Then it's a home." He pulled his gloves tighter. He was a sentimental old fool, but he wasn't wrong about that. In the second week of November, a car came down the county road that didn't belong. It was a black sedan, clean, the kind that gets detailed instead of washed, with plates from Illinois. It pulled up to the Dawson place while I was mending wire along the shared fence line, close enough to see but far enough that the man who got out didn't notice me right away. He was tall, angular, wearing a jacket designed for a city that never dropped below 40. He walked to June's front door with the stride of a man who expected the world to organize itself around his arrival. June opened the door. From where I stood, 50 yards away, I saw her shoulders pull back. Not fear. Not retreat. Just the automatic bracing of someone who recognizes a shape they thought they'd left behind. I set down my fence pliers and walked toward the house. I didn't hurry. Cattle don't respond well to people who rush, and neither do situations like this. I walked the way I walked through a pasture, steady, visible, present. By the time I reached the porch, he was talking. "Can't just disappear, June. You left a note." A note. After 5 years. I deserve a conversation. "You deserve exactly what I gave you," June said. "Which is more notice than you gave me about any decision you made for 5 years. He saw me then. Looked me over, the boots, the hat, the fencing pliers still in my hand because I'd forgotten to set them down. He looked at me like a blueprint that didn't meet code. "Who's this?" "My neighbor. Your neighbor." He said it the way you'd say a word in a language you found amusing. "June. What is this? You moved to the middle of nowhere. You're living in a house that doesn't have central air, and your nearest friend is a rancher?" "He's not just my neighbor, Derek." She stepped forward, onto the porch, into the space between him and the door. "He's the person who stopped on the road when I was carrying groceries in the cold because I didn't know how to drive. Because you drove for me for 5 years and I never learned. He's the person who sat next to me every Wednesday and Saturday for a month and taught me how. He never chose my route. He never told me I was going the wrong way. He said try again every time I crashed, and he meant it, and that's more patience than you showed me in half a decade. June, I left because I was a passenger. Derek, in the car, in the kitchen, in every room of that apartment. You drove my whole life, and you called it love, and I believed you, because I didn't know what it felt like to hold the wheel. I know now, and I am not getting back in your passenger seat. Not today. Not ever." She said it standing on a porch in Montana, with the mountains behind her, and the wind pulling at her braid, and her voice never rising above the volume you'd use to tell someone dinner was ready. She said it with the clarity of a woman who had walked 4 miles on gravel and learned to drive a 3-ton truck and crashed on purpose, and told the truth about all of it, because the truth was the one thing she'd never been allowed to drive before, and now she was behind the wheel of that too. Derek stood there for a moment. He looked at the mountains like he was trying to understand what they were for. Then he got in his sedan and drove away, and June watched him go the way I had watched Jess go 3 years earlier, without chasing, without calling out, just standing still and letting someone leave who needed to leave. When his car disappeared around the bend, June sat down on the porch step. I sat down next to her, not touching, just present. Hutch, who had followed me from the fence line on instinct, lay down at her feet and put his chin on her boot. "I'm keeping the truck, by the way," she said. "You don't have a truck. I'm buying one tomorrow, something smaller than yours, because your truck is a war crime against parallel parking. But I'm getting one, and I'm driving it, and I'm never asking anyone's permission to go anywhere ever again." She bought a truck. A '04 Tacoma, dark green, from a lot in Bozeman. She drove it home herself, on the highway, at the speed limit, without hitting a single thing. 8 months later, the Dawson place doesn't look like the Dawson place anymore. June replaced Helen's yellow curtains with white ones she picked herself. She planted a garden along the south side that Jean's wife Ruth helps her with on weekends. The two of them arguing cheerfully about the spacing of tomato plants, while Jean and I find reasons to be elsewhere. June started working at the physical therapy clinic in Livingston, different from her job in Chicago. Smaller, but hers in a town she chose on a road she drives herself. She comes over to the ranch most evenings. We cook together. Her recipes from the clinic's nutritionist. My recipes from my grandfather's handwriting on index cards, stained with 30 years of kitchen grease. We eat at the 4-person table with all 4 legs on the floor and both seats occupied, and some nights Jean and Ruth join us, and the kitchen is louder than it's been since my grandfather was alive. The mailbox has been replaced. June bought a new one and installed it herself, without asking for help, which I found out when I drove home one afternoon, and there it was, straight, level, freshly mounted on a new post. She'd painted a small green stripe on it. When I asked why, she said it matched her truck. I didn't argue. Last week, on a Sunday morning, June and I drove out to the far end of the ranch property, past the creek bottom and up the rise where you can see the entire valley laid out. The river, the pastures, the Absarokas in the west, and the Crazies in the east, and the whole wide stretch of sky in between. She parked the Tacoma and we sat on the tailgate with coffee and said nothing for a long time because the view was doing all the talking. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah, I'm sorry about the mailbox." "Which time?" "Both times. And the ditch. And the intersection. And every other thing I hit on purpose because I was too scared to say I just wanted to sit next to you." June. "Yeah, I sat on that porch alone for 3 years. I ate at that table alone. I watched the light leave the valley every night alone. And the whole time I told myself the fence was keeping things safe, when all it was doing was keeping everything out. You walked up my road carrying grocery bags and you asked me to teach you something, and what you were actually doing was teaching me that a gate is only useful if you open it once in a while." I looked at her. "So don't apologize for the mailbox. It was the best thing that happened to it." She leaned her shoulder against mine, and I leaned back, and the valley was quiet, and the cattle were grazing along the creek line below us, and Hutch was asleep in the truck bed with his nose in the sun, and everything was exactly as ordinary and as enormous as a Montana morning is supposed to be. On a ranch, you learn that the things that matter don't move in straight lines. Cattle wander. Creeks bend. Roads curve around whatever the land won't let you go through. You can build the straightest fence in the valley, and the herd will still find a way to drift. Because living things don't follow the path you laid out for them. They follow the path that makes sense to them, even when it looks like a mess from where you're standing. And maybe people are the same. Maybe the straightest route to someone you care about isn't saying what you feel. Maybe it's hitting a mailbox on purpose, and stalling at an intersection you've already mastered, and driving into a ditch you could have avoided. Because every manufactured disaster is another hour in a truck with someone who says try again like they mean it, and one day, after enough crashed lessons and enough quiet evenings, you finally understand that the person in the passenger seat was never really learning to drive. She was learning to stay. And you were learning to let her.